All right, we will get started in about 3 minutes here at 7 p.m. Central Time. So bear with me for a couple minutes. Hey, Paolo. Can you hear me? So it does actually automatically save the stream, and it'll create it as a video that can be viewed on the channel. But in addition, I'm actually recording this also. It won't record the chat. It's just going to actually record the audio and the video. All right. Well, it is 7 o'clock, so let's get started. Before we actually get into any of the meat and potatoes of how to do any of this actual work, I kind of want to talk about why we would do something like this. For anybody who's familiar with GNS3, you may be using the GNS3 VM, and there's some limitations with that. So say you're running it on a laptop and you have 16 gigs of RAM. Well, when you build a large topology or you use appliances in GNS3 that you have large memory requirements, you're going to very quickly run out of RAM on that laptop to be able to build the topology that you want. Now, obviously, you could run on a desktop that would have much more resources than the laptop, but there's instances where you may need to go even beyond what the desktop can support. In addition, the GNS3 VM has some limitations. So if you use the GNS3 VM on VMware Workstation as an example, I believe you're limited to 64 gigs of RAM. In addition, if you use the ESXi from VMware, I think you're limited to 128 gigs of RAM per VM. So if you're building very, very large topologies, that's not going to be enough. Now, you could run multiple VMs, but why go through all that hassle of having multiple VMs on one server when you can just run Ubuntu on that server, Ubuntu server specifically, and install GNS3 as a service and have it just running all the time. So this presents you with more options. So for instance, you could have a small server or large server sitting at your house, and you could connect to it with your laptop or with the desktop, and it's not going to use any of the resources on that particular system. In addition, if you have a VPN at your house, you could actually VPN if you're outside of the house on your laptop into your house and then connect to the GNS3 server and still have access to all of those system resources. So there's some definitely compelling reasons for installing GNS3 as a server and doing bare metal on the server. You're going to get a little bit more resources out of it. You're going to get better flexibility for what you need to do and how you need to do it. So ultimately, it's a benefit. And these days, you can pick up a cheap server for like $500 that will have 128 gigs of RAM and will probably have 24 or more cores. That's a lot of system resources to be able to run GNS3 appliances on and build large-scale topologies, or just use appliances that have pretty high system resources. As an example, the Juniper VMXs, I think they require either 6 or 8 gig just to run one VMX. So that kind of gives you an idea of how limited you can be when you're just using a laptop as an example. So now that I've kind of given the overview of why we might want to do something like this, we're going to go through a whole bunch of steps, and we are going to actually take I have a small computer here. It doesn't have a whole lot of cores or anything like that, but it's got enough for us to be able to do what we want to do and show you as an example of how to do this. Yeah, so let's get started. Over on the right of the stream, you'll see I've got some tasks listed. We just did the overview, and from that point on, we're pretty much going to start at the top, and we're going to go through this step by step. In addition, I'm going to go ahead and link the guide that I wrote into the chat. For anybody who's watching this later, this might be a recorded YouTube video that I edited or whatever. You probably won't see that link, but I'll have a link to it in the video notes. All right. So let's get started. All right. So, well, actually, you know what? Before I do that, let's bring up that website and show you basically what the process is. All right. So this is a lot of words. I'll be the first to admit it. But I want to highlight a few things. So this video and this stream is not about how to install Ubuntu. It's not going to teach you how to use Linux. Okay. This is purely focused on installing GNS3 as a server and getting it up and running so that when you reboot that server or the power goes off and it starts back up later again, it automatically starts up, it's running, and it's available for you. All right. There's some basic instructions for the document, and then I've got it broken down into steps, so it should be fairly easy to follow along with. And down at the bottom, I have some additional software that we're going to install that will help us to monitor the server. All right, so that's that. All right, so let's get down to it. So what I've done already is I have installed Ubuntu Server 18.04, which is the long-term support version. But I have done, well, I take that back. I've done one other thing. I've set up my SSH key to be able to log in from my desktop that I'm streaming from without having to put in a password so that I can log into that box. Now that box is called demo. All right. So if I do SSH demo, normally, well, as you can see, I will be able to log in without putting in a password. Normally, go ahead and exit out of it again. You would have to do SSH the username that you want to log in as, and then either the IP address or the host name if you have it set up in your host file, or if you have a DNS server set up. But I don't need to do that, so all I need to do is this. Ignore the fact that there's a key difference there, because I've rebuilt that particular system with the same IP address probably 12 times today. All right, so first off, I want to show a couple things. So when you log into an Ubuntu server installed, there's some information that it gives you, and some of this stuff is really useful. As an example, it tells you the IP address. So if for some reason you ever forget what the IP address is, you can log into it locally, you know, with a keyboard and a monitor hooked up to the server, and you will be able to see the IP address. The other thing is it will tell you how many packages need to be updated. So packages are software. Think of them as, some of them may be security updates, but for the most part, it's just updates to the software or the operating system itself. Whenever you build a new server, it's always a good idea to go ahead and get everything up to date as much as possible. I don't necessarily recommend anytime there being updates to go ahead and apply those updates, because sometimes those updates will break things that you've got installed. So that's kind of a basic sysadmin thought process for any operating system. You don't just go ahead and install all of the updates as soon as they come out, because you need to test to see whether or not it's going to break any critical services that are running on that machine. So the first thing we want to do is we want to update the repository cache on this system. So the repositories are, just think of it as a big software site. So think of it as like the App Store on Mac OS, or the Windows Store, whatever. So this is, Ubuntu actually has a whole bunch of servers, and on there they have all of the software, all of the versions that apply to basically any recent version of Ubuntu. And then it also includes software. So if you want to install new software, you're going to be most likely, for most things, pulling it from the Ubuntu repositories. Now, that doesn't apply with GNS3, and I'm going to show you how that works a little bit later on during this stream. All right, so first I want to just update the repository caches on this computer. So I do a sudo space apt-get space update. Put in my password. It goes out, connects to those repositories, pulls down basically index files, and checks those index files against what I have installed on the system, and then caches that data. So now what I want to do is I want to actually update everything. So you can do an upgrade for a single package, you can do an upgrade for multiple packages, or what you can do is what's called a full upgrade. And what this will do is any software or any portion of the operating system that has a newer version available, it will automatically install it. What this won't do, however, this will not upgrade, as an example, this Ubuntu 18.04 install to an Ubuntu 19.10 install. There's a separate command for that, and that's not in scope for what I'm trying to show you. All right, so we're going to run the upgrade. It's going to ask me if I want to continue. You'll notice it's going to download 33.5 megs of files, and yeah, so let's go ahead and run that. That'll take a minute or two. The download portion, obviously that's going to depend on how much bandwidth you have. The actual application of updating all this software will depend on how many cores you have and how fast those cores are. So just like any other computer, also your hard drive speed will be taken into account. So, you know, the better your computer, the faster this process is going to go. The older the server, it's going to go a little bit slower. All right, so it is almost done installing. Now, one of the things when you first install, as an example, like especially Ubuntu 18.04, it's going to have some older versions of stuff on it, especially things like the kernel, may be updated when you do this full upgrade. So it's usually a good idea that once you've fully updated all the software, to go ahead and reboot the system. This will allow you to boot the system off of any upgraded kernels or start any software that's been upgraded. So all we have to do for that is a sudo space reboot. And you'll notice that my remote connection has failed. It's been closed by the remote host. Now I want to check and monitor for when it comes back up. So the easiest way for me to do that is just to do a ping. And obviously you would put the IP address or whatever is applicable for your situation. All right, so it's already back up and running. All right, so let's go ahead and log back in. All right, so now we see we have 0 packages can be updated and there's 0 security updates. So that's great. So we are up to date. Everything's good. All right. So we have updated the OS. All right. So the next thing we want to do is we want to add the repository for GNS3, for the software that GNS3 is. Think of this as, for all intents and purposes, all you're really doing is just adding another entry that says, hey, for this particular piece of, or pieces of software, you're going to go to this repository instead of using the official Ubuntu repositories. Because there is GNS3 available in the Ubuntu repositories, but it's usually a few versions behind, and I don't recommend using those. So let's go ahead and add that repository. So to do that, pretty easy command, sudo apt-add repository. And then this particular repository is what's called a PPA. Don't ask me what it stands for. I don't remember off the top of my head. So I'm going to do PPA:GNS3/PPA. This is going to ask me, once I get through the sudo password, it is going to ask me if I want to add the key for that. And all you have to do is press enter to accept it. I'm going to run that sudo apt-get update again to refresh my repository caches. Now, on the GNS3 community, I've seen a lot of questions about what versions of GNS3 are available on the repositories. There's a really easy way to check to see what version is available. And all that is sudo apt search and then the name of the package. You can do partial names because it's actually a search utility. But in this specific case, we're going to look just for the GNS3 server software. And if you look right there, there's our version number. So that's the most current version that's available on the website, 2.2.3. If you go to GitHub, that's what's on there, other than the development branches or unstable branches, whichever they may be. Wouldn't recommend using those necessarily unless you're trying to test new features or provide feedback to the GNS3 development team. Okay, so we've determined that 2.2.3 is the only package that's available, the only version of that package. All right, so we want to actually install it now. We've completed adding the GNS PPA. All right, so we're going to install it. This is very easy. All we need to do is sudo apt-get install GNS3-server. Okay, so later on, you're going to see there's going to be a command that's GNS3 server that's all one word. All right, that is the command that you're going to use to start the server, but that is not the same as the name of the package. Make sure that you use the dash in there, otherwise it won't work. In fact, if I go ahead and do this, and you'll see that it's not going to be able to find the package. See, unable to locate GNS or package GNS3 server. So what we actually want to do is, if you don't know the name, you can do a search and it'll give you the name. For instance, if I do sudo apt search GNS3, we have a bunch of different options in here. Okay. We have this GNS3, we have the GNS3 GUI, GNS3 IOU, GNS3 server, and then whatever this is, which I don't think this has anything to do with GNS3 itself. For anybody that's curious, if you're on Linux and you want to just run everything locally on your computer, just install GNS3-GUI. That will install the server and the GUI client. GNS3 IOU is something that you need to install if you want support for Cisco IOU appliances, and that's not something I'm really going to talk about. If you notice, so there's a GNS3 entry up here, and it says Graphical Network Simulator, but look at this version number. This is definitely not the most current version, so I wouldn't recommend using that. Okay. And this is the one that we're actually going to install, GNS3-server. So let's go ahead and install that. Sudo apt get install GNS3-server. Okay, so it's going to download a whole bunch of stuff. And it'll take a minute. During this process, there's going to be a screen that's going to come up, and it's going to ask you about Wireshark. It has to do with the permissions. Oh, actually, sorry. This one's all about Ubridge. I forgot. Wireshark's when you're doing the client install. All right. So when this window comes up, you can either answer yes or no. If you're running this locally on your laptop and you're not running it as a service, I would recommend selecting yes. That will allow your account to be added to a group that will allow you to start up GNS3 and have access to the Ubridge software, which manages all the connections between appliances. I'm just going to hit yes. It doesn't really matter for this particular case, but I'm going to hit yes. So it's going to go through and install a whole bunch of packages. Should be almost done. Yep, getting there. So what this is doing is this is installing all of the different software that's needed by the GNS3 server to run and function. Things like KVM, kernel virtualization or virtual machine, which is basically the hypervisor that Linux is using to virtualize all of the appliances and run them. Ubridge, a whole bunch of other stuff. All right, so it's completed. There's another step that I want to do. Sometimes people have systems that don't have virtualization enabled within the BIOS on the CPU. So there's a way to check that. So to do that, we need to install a small piece of software. So we're going to do sudo apt get install, as always. And it's called CPU-checker. Okay, I've already got it installed. So in order to check to see whether or not we have virtualization support, we do a command called kvm-ok. In this case, we want to do it as a sudo because you need root privileges or elevated privileges to be able to get this to work correctly. So if your virtualization is working correctly, you will see this message. It'll say KVM acceleration can be used. If it's not enabled in your BIOS for the CPU, then you're going to get a message that says that it can't be used. So there's that. Okay, so we've installed the GNS3 server software. And now what we need to do is we need to create a file that is going to become the service that will run GNS3 in the background on this server all the time. So if you shut the computer down and then restart it, it will automatically start the GNS3 server back up. No user intervention required on your part. All right. So to do that, we have to edit a text file. Now, there's a couple of different text editors that you can use for command line in Linux. There's VI, and then there's another one called Vim, and there's a whole bunch of others. I generally use VI just because that's what I'm used to using. If you're not familiar with Linux, I would probably recommend using Vim, VIM, as it's a little bit more user-friendly. It's still command line, but it has a command line version of a UI, so it kind of tells you what to do and gives you kind of a menu structure to work with. VI doesn't, but that's all right. So what I'm going to do is I am going to use VI, and second, I'm just getting the path for the file. Okay, so VI, when you open up a file that doesn't exist, it doesn't actually create the file yet. It just allows you to edit it. And then when you go to exit out of VI, you have options to actually write the file. This particular file is a configuration file that specifies how GNS3 server should be run as a VM, or sorry, as a service. So here we go. All right. So when you first start up VI and the file doesn't already exist, this is what you're going to get. Now, if you start typing here, it's not going to do what you expect, because right now we are, for all intents and purposes, in a menu. It doesn't show a menu, but for all intents and purposes, we are in a menu, and we have to go into append mode because we want to add text onto this file. So if I hit the letter A on my keyboard, you'll see how at the bottom it actually changed to insert. All right, so that's allowing me to actually enter text in. Now, I'm not going to type out the whole thing. I am just going to copy and paste because I don't want to have to type all that stuff in there. This is the benefit of interacting with the server over an SSH connection versus doing it locally on a keyboard and a display at that server, because then you'd have to type all of this. It's not a lot, but it's a whole lot easier to not have to type it. So this is what we're doing, all right? This is all this file consists of. We have a description so that when we do certain things, we'll see that it says GNS3 service or server. In this case, we also have we're specifying it as a service, and then we're specifying the actual executable file that will be turned into the service. And then this last part is specifying how, or I should say, in which condition the GNS3 server would be started as a service. So Linux allows different boot levels where you can either have multi-user or single user, and there's a couple others. We want multi-user. So when the system boots up normally, which generally speaking normally is going to be multi-user, we want the service to start. Usually single user mode is for troubleshooting and stuff like that, and we don't necessarily want the GNS3 server running in that condition. So we have the file set up. Now we need to save it. So to get out of the insert mode or append mode, press the escape key. You'll notice that the insert went away down here at the bottom, and your cursor moved over back one because we're no longer appending, we're just sitting at the menu. You use actual just key presses to do functions when you're in the menu mode. So in this case, I do colon, which tells it that I'm going to give it a command to do something. W is going to write the file and save it. Quit, or Q, is going to obviously quit out of VI. And then sometimes you may need to do the exclamation mark, otherwise referred to as bang. And what this does is this allows you to write quit without asking if I'm sure. You know how, like, Microsoft as an example, it's constantly asking, are you sure you want to do this? Are you really, really sure you want to do this? Well, this is going to bypass all of that. All right. So the file exists, and if we want to see it, that it exists, we can do an ls, which is basically listing the contents of a directory. So if we copy that, and get rid of that. So we will see GNS3.service. So the next part that we need to do is we need to actually enable this file as a service. So there's a couple steps that we need to do for that. I'm going to copy and paste from the document that I created just to make my life easier. So we're going to set this as an executable file. This isn't actually necessary. I just do it out of habit. The chmod plus x, what that does is it does a modification to the permissions on that file and adds executable. So that's done. The next part, we need to actually enable it as a service, and that's a pretty easy command. It's just going to be sudo space systemctl space enable space GNS3. What that does is that creates a symbolic link to this GNS3.service file and enables it within the system as an actual service. As you can see, it created the symbolic link, so that's good. And then the last step that we need to do is we're actually going to start the service. Now, once we've created it as a service, if we rebooted the computer right now and brought it back up, it would actually already start the GNS3 server. But generally speaking, I like to actually start it and then do a status on it to make sure that it's working correctly. All right. So to do that, all we have to do is systemctl space start space GNS3 and obviously sudo in the front of it again. And that will actually start the service. You won't see any output from it. So how do you know that it's actually running? Well, okay. That's really easy. We change it from start to status. And now we have an output that shows that it's up and running. So we have active running, that means it's running. And it also gives you the last few basically like log entries as the server started up. And you're just looking to see if there's any errors here. In this case, there's no errors. Everything looks perfectly fine. To exit out of this little status thing, just press the Q button. Okay. All right. So let's test that the service will persist after a reboot. So sudo reboot. Obviously, our connection got closed again because the server is rebooting. And we'll do the ping again to see for when it comes back up. Won't take long. There we go. Just like that. It's already back up and running. Now, to be fair, if this was a server, it wouldn't be that quick to reboot. Servers shut down and start up a lot slower because there's a whole bunch of hardware stuff that has to happen. But this is just a little desktop. So let's go back into it by SSH. All right. One thing you'll notice is that now when we boot up, we have and log in, we have an additional IP address. That VIR BR0, that's a virtual bridge. That's something that is used within the GNS3 server to handle some of the network connections. So don't get that confused with the actual IP address for the system, because you won't be able to connect to this necessarily from an outside source. All right, so let's do our check to see if the server is back up and running. And look at that, it's up and running. We are good. All right, so hit Q again to get out of that. So we have enabled that, we have started that. Okay, so on top of the GNS3 server software, there are some things that I usually install that come in kind of handy when you're dealing with a bare metal install of the GNS3 server. So there's times where you want to monitor the system resources of that server. Now, by default, there's a command called top that's installed, but it doesn't. If you know what you're looking at, it's useful, but realistically, it doesn't necessarily tell you in a really easily read version of what's going on in your server. If you do start up top and you want to exit out of it, just hit Control C. What we're going to do is we're going to install something called htop. Htop, in my opinion, is a much more user-friendly version, especially for people who are new to Linux. Htop is a whole lot better. So just a sudo apt-get install htop. All right. It's already installed. All right, so let's go ahead and start htop so you can see what it looks like. So this is what it looks like. The really important parts from the perspective of running this as a bare metal GNS3 server are these areas. These are going to be graphs that as your CPU utilization goes up, these graphs will fill up and it'll give you the percentage. Each one of these graphs represents a thread. So as an example, this particular system has 2 cores and 2 threads per core. It's like an i3 4 series, so it's not really a beefy computer. But say, for instance, you have a server that's got 2 6-core processors and 2 threads per core. You would have 24 of these graphs going across. It also shows you your memory status. So here's your total memory. This is how much is being used, and it gives you a little graph. And this will also show you your swap. So in case you're oversubscribing your RAM, you'll see that your swap will start to get used. This is a good thing to monitor when you're starting to build really large topologies. You'll find that sometimes, depending on how big it is, you may have to start just certain appliances in groups so that you're not overloading the system. To exit out of this, if you're using an SSH terminal, you can just put your mouse over the F10 and click. If you're locally there on the box, you'll need to hit F10 or Control C. Another really useful utility, if you have a system that tends to run hot, like one of my desktops is a i9-7900X. That thing runs ridiculously hot, even with a all-in-one water cooler on there. There is a piece of software that you can install that will allow you to monitor your core temps from the command line. It's called lm-sensors. So sudo apt-get install lm-sensors. Now, to run it, it's not lm-sensors. It's just sensors. Now, that tells you what it's at currently, and it's just a snapshot in time. If you want to actually monitor this, here's how you would do it. Watch space -n space 1 space sensors. Watch command will refresh a command, and then the -n space 1 tells it every 1 second. So now, if I hit enter, it's actually going to update those core temps every second for me. So now, if we watch, you'll notice slight changes. For instance, core 1 just went from 27 to down to 26. The package ID just went up to 30. This is really useful, like I said, if you have a system that runs hot. To exit out of this, just hit Control C. There's one other piece of software that I want to install, and that's called docker.io. On the GNS3 marketplace, there are certain appliances that use Docker images. Some of them are really, really useful, but out of the box, the GNS3 server software doesn't install support for Docker. So we're going to go ahead and add that. So sudo space apt-get install docker.io. Now there is another variant that's just straight Docker. I haven't tested to see whether or not installing Docker by itself will work or if it has to be Docker.io. I've had no issues running this with Docker.io. So that's what I tend to go with. One of these days I'll get around to testing it. So we're going to install that. That's going to take a minute again. Fortunately, it doesn't usually take too long. Should be almost done because it's already doing the man DB. Yep, there we go, just like that. And there's nothing you need to run. It automatically sets up Docker to do what it needs to do. I think that's everything that we need to do on the server itself. Yep, we are almost done. All right, so let's go ahead and exit out of here because we don't, well, actually, you know what? I'm going to leave HTOP running so that we can see our CPU utilization later on when we start up an appliance. So let's go ahead and that this way. We'll just put that all the way across there. Okay. So right there we can see our CPU utilization. I'm not worried about the RAM because I'm not going to load up enough appliances to actually affect that too much. All right, so now we want to actually start up the GNS3 client. This set on here. All right. So I have started this GNS3 client before. Currently, it's set up to use the desktop itself as the GNS3 server. And this is similar to what you're going to see if you're set up using the GNS3 VM. So what we want to do is we want to stop using the VM. Now, you can use the VM and the bare metal server at the same time. But in most cases, if you have a beefy enough server, there's no reason to have to do that. So we want to go ahead and we want to change our server preferences. On Windows and Linux, it's going to be under Edit and then Preferences. On the Mac, it's a little bit different. I think it's under the normal Mac system menu for the piece of software. I haven't used a Mac in a while, so forgive me. All right, so if you click on server, you'll see right now it's set up where it's got enable local server, and that's checkmarked. So we want to disable that in this particular case because I don't want to use this system that I'm on right now as the server. I want to use my server that I just built. So I'm going to uncheck that. This changes the options, and now I can put in either the IP address, or in my case, I can put in just demo. But you know what? I'll put in the IP address just so that y'all can see what it looks like. So you would put in an IP address, and then I haven't tested whether or not by default the authentication works. I generally uncheck it because in order to get into my network, I've already authenticated against the network, so I'm not really worried about it. As an alternative, if you wanted to keep your local server, you could keep that enabled and you could go into remote servers and you could add that server that you just built in here, and now you'll have 2 entries over in the server monitor. But in this case, we're just going to go with the 1 server. So we hit apply, we hit OK, and if you notice now instead of local, it says demo, and we're up and running. So if I create a project real quick, Untitled works. One thing about this is, so when you install the GNS3 server software, there's no appliances loaded on it. So if you've already got all your appliances loaded on the VM or on your local server, you'll need to re-import them into the new server. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to import an appliance. And I'm going to load up the Cumulus VX switch. And I want to install this on the main server. Now, if you are running the VM locally and you're connected to the new server, you'll have the choice between these two, or if you have it set up for a remote server, you'll have to choose which one is the accurate one. In this case, in my configuration right now, it's the main server. So I click next, next. I have a version that's ready to go. Yes, I want to install it. And as you can see, while it's copying that file, because it actually has to copy that image file over to that server. It doesn't actually run it off of your computer. You'll notice my CPU utilization went up while it was doing that. It doesn't just copy, it also goes through and does a hash on it to make sure that there's no issues with the file. So we click finish, okay, verily, go into switches, we can now see Cumulus VX. All right, so I'm gonna drag just one for right now. And I'm gonna start it. You'll notice it started up over here, and you'll see that our CPU utilization on one of our threads has maxed out. Generally speaking, you'll find that most appliances will drop the CPU utilization after the boot process. Some of them won't, so you have to be aware of that when you're trying to figure out how much resources a particular appliance is going to use. In this case, I need to change my console application because I don't have Xterm. I have GNOME Terminal. And let's go into the console. And it should be booting up. Depending on the appliance, boot times will vary. I've done that, and we have imported appliance. Look at that. All that stuff's done. This isn't the fastest computer in the world, so it's going to probably be a minute. There we go. And just like that, I am inside of a running Cumulus VX switch. So let's do something else. Let's add more so we can, helps if I put in the right password. So it has shut off already. So let's do something here. And we are going to add a whole bunch so we can see what it looks like when we boot up a whole bunch of devices and max out CPU utilization. So I'm going to run 10 of them. I don't remember what the RAM requirements are for Cumulus VX. I think it's only like 512 megs of RAM. So I have more than enough RAM because I've got 16 gigs. But I'm guessing that I will probably max out all 4 of these threads for a few minutes while everything boots. So let's see what happens. Yep, look at that. This is a perfect example of why it's useful to have a bare bones actual server with lots of cores. Because you can only run so much of a topology. So this will take a minute to boot. There is no doubt about that in my mind. It's not what I wanted to do. Start up a console. So that's going to take a few minutes. And if you'll notice, even right now, I'm sitting at 7600% CPU utilization. RAM's perfectly fine. I've got plenty of RAM for what I'm doing, but my CPU utilization is definitely getting kicked by these 10 appliances. Seeing as how you're my only viewer there, Paolo, do you have any questions? Still going. There we go. Maxed out all the CPU again, and now it's dropping back down. So now all of these should be up and running, which I am quite sure that they are. Yep. Towards the end. Yep. So there you have it. It works. It's a pretty simple process. I think I've done a pretty decent job of documenting it on the webpage that I built for the document for it. There you go. Well, so Paolo, I've got time, and I can edit the video later. So, you wanted to go over the LM sensors again? All right. So, I did include it on the document, I believe. Yes, it is there. It's down all the way at the bottom, just in case you're looking at it. But it's really easy. Sudo apt-get install lm-sensors. No worries. We can do it now. It's going to say it's already installed. Oops. Helps if I type the password correctly. It's already installed. So normally, if you just run sensors, it doesn't update dynamically in near real time. It's just a one-shot deal. But if I do the watch command, so the watch command will basically run a command over and over and over again, and based on the interval. So if I do just watch sensors as an example, it does it every 2 seconds. That's the default. I tend to try and do it a little bit more frequent than that. So if we do a -n space 1, that will actually update it every 1 second. Now there's another thing with the LM sensors. 1 second to look it up. Sensors detect. All right. So if I do a sudo sensors detect, it will actually go through a more in-depth scan of the system looking for sensors. So in this case, I'm going to say yes, because I want to go ahead and scan them. It found an Intel digital thermal sensor. Then it talks about the Super I/O chips can contain embedded sensors. I've never had an issue with doing this, even though, you know, it says this is usually safe. I've never had an issue. So we're going to go ahead and do yes. Same. Basically going through everything to see if there's additional sensors. As an example, on my i9 7900X, there is a ton of sensors that it finds, because that thing's got 10 cores and all kinds of weird things going on inside of it. I'm probably not going to find anything additional doing this scan, but do it anyway. Okay, so it gives you a summary. You want to add these automatically? Yes. And then if we do sensors again, you'll probably see more information. Not really too much more. It doesn't actually give me any values for the core temp ISA or for the ISA adapter, but depending on the type of system and the motherboard you've got, you may have a whole bunch more data on here. So once again, just to run it every second, that's all you need to do. Oh, helps if I type the command correctly. I accidentally got a 4 in there. Just like that, it will update. So this comes in useful when, like I said, when you have a system that is running very hot. And that's it. You got anything else for me, Paolo? I'm glad it's working on your system. That's awesome. Yeah, normally when I'm running a big topology on one of my servers, I'll have HTOP and the sensors running as just small windows, because as an example, if you go in and you SSH into it again, and I do that, I can change the size of the window so it's only showing me the information that I want. Just like that. So now I can see my CPU load and I can see my core temps. All right, well, I guess it's time to close up shop then. Thanks for joining me, and expect to hear from me again fairly soon. I'll be probably doing another live stream this weekend. I want to either do building VMs inside of GNS3, or I want to do go through, possibly test out that remote install script that they have on their site, and test some of the upgrade stuff that people are having issues with, to see if I can figure out what's going on. All right. Well, that is all I have. So have yourself a wonderful evening, and Happy New Year's. Oh, and don't forget to give it a like if you can.